Today. This is the final day in our inaugural programs that we're putting on for the 100th Congress. So if you've joined us all week long, we appreciate it. If you're just joining us today, you're in for a treat. My name is Chris Myers. I'm Managing Director of the Capital Campus Program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. What the Capital Campus Program looks to do is bring together policymakers and academics to bridge kind of that gap that might exist with policymakers and they're looking for information from an academic perspective. So today we're going to be dealing with economic development, and throughout the week we've dealt with other issues including financial services, the shape of the economy in general. But we have lots of resources, so if you do have some need for scholarly advice or academic perspectives on a lot of issues, please think of us when you're thinking of people, and we would be more than happy to assist you in any way that we possibly can. Like I said, today we're going to be dealing with economic development at home and abroad is the perspective that we're bringing here. And we have two great scholars that are joining us today, as well as Dan Rothchild, the Associate Director of the Global Prosperity Initiative, which is our program, as Dan will explain, that looks at a lot of these issues. Dan is, like I said, the Associate Director, and he will be making the introductions. But I do want to make two quick program notes. For one, the flyer for next week, we do have a program on budget. We're going to have Roland Myers from the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus come and talk about budget issues and things that you guys have been dealing with regard to making sure that you understand the process and some of the reforms that are being proposed as well. And also on that blue form, if you could take a second to fill out the surveys, it helps us to better calculate how to put these programs together, and also tell us if we're providing you with the right kind of information. So if I go ahead and introduce things.
Thanks, Chris. I'll try to keep my remarks relatively brief and let the interesting people get help here and begin their presentations. As Chris said, my name is Dan Rothchild. I'm the Associate Director of the Global Prosperity Initiative at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. The mission of the Mercatus Center is to analyze and better understand the institutions, the incentives, and the policies that allow for a free, prosperous, and flourishing society. Mercatus is a nonprofit university-based research group focused on the economics of public policy issues. And a lot of the economic public policy issues that we look at fall under the purview of the Global Prosperity Initiative. In a big way, what the Global Prosperity Initiative looks at, what we try to research through a combination of traditional economic analysis as well as ethnographic research and field research, which involves a lot of going into the field and examining the way that sociologists or anthropologists would, but through the economic lens, the institutions that allow for economic growth and the institutions that allow for economic opportunity. And that's something both at home and abroad. We don't think that there are different rules of economics that apply in the United States from Germany, from South Africa. So what we're really interested in looking at in all of these different contexts is what are the institutions, what are the rules of the game, as economists call them, that allow entrepreneurs and other creative people to make positive change within their society. A big part of what we look at is the formal and informal institutions, and I'm sure both of the scholars who are going to be speaking today will address those in a little bit more detail. But we think that involves going, for example, and looking beyond what are the laws on the books in a particular country to looking at what's actually happening on the ground. Carol Boudreau's research in particular, which focuses on sub-Saharan African economic development, focuses a lot on what in many situations is a pretty large bridge between what the laws are on the books and the way that people actually operate on the ground. So what we try to figure out is why is there this divide? Is there a way to bring them together? And how is it that different policies have evolved in different places? What does it tell us about growth, opportunity, and allowing people the opportunity to create better lives for themselves and for their families? We've done a lot in the Global Prosperity Initiative, both at home and abroad. Among the projects that I want to mention very briefly are our Gulf Coast Recovery Project, which we started about 3 years ago, shortly after Hurricane Katrina. It's a 5-year project looking at the rebuilding of the Gulf Coast. and the role that the for-profit, non-profit, public sectors are all playing in that rebuilding effort. We've done a lot in international economic development. We've done field work in over 24 countries around the world on 5 different continents. And increasingly what we're doing is we're taking the insights that we've gleaned abroad and a lot of the research that's been done at Mercatus and elsewhere in economic growth and development in the international context and applying some of its lessons here in America. Eileen Norcross is heading up a new initiative that we're currently putting together that's going to be focusing on intergovernmental finance within the United States, and again, the public policies that work on a local level to either increase the fortunes or decrease the fortunes of local economies. So the 2 topics that are going to be addressed today, we're going to begin with Eileen Norcross. As I mentioned, she does a lot with intergovernmental transfers, which include a lot of grant programs, certainly a lot of things that are going to be affected by whatever kind of stimulus bill ultimately comes out of Congress. Eileen has also done a lot of research on the Community Development Block Grant Program, the incentives that's put into place, and the ways in which that has been relatively more and less effective in the myriad different things that it tries to do. Eileen's also done work on the Road Home program at the Gulf Coast Recovery Project. Carol Boudreau is the lead scholar on Enterprise Africa, which is a program at the Mercatus Center that focuses on sub-Saharan African economic growth through the lens of entrepreneurs, looking at either the policies that enable or hinder economic growth and allow or hinder entrepreneurs to improve their societies and decrease poverty through entrepreneurship. Now you might say these 2 things don't have a whole lot to do with each other, but I think there's 3 things to bear in mind when listening to both of their presentations, and you'll see where the connection is. Those things are institutions, innovation, and incentives. First rule of economics is that people respond to incentives. So one of the first questions that Carol and Eileen ask in their work is, what are the incentives in place? What do they tell us about how people respond to different policies? Innovation is critical. Innovation is what allows economic growth. Innovation is what allows wider expanded economic opportunity. What are the policies that allow innovation to occur, allow entrepreneurship to occur, and encourage it to occur? And what are the institutions that are supportive of entrepreneurs, that are supportive of creating widespread economic growth? Their research, as I think you'll see, is also, while it's grounded in the academy and in scholarship, it is something where as Chris pointed out, it's important in Mercatus that our research be policy relevant. We see ourselves as a bridge between the academy and policymakers. It's important to us, though, that this bridge works 2 ways. We're not coming in trying to just tell you what to do. We think it's also very important that we hear from policymakers about what the actual real world of policymaking is, what are the questions that you have, and how can academic research be helpful to you in that regard. Eileen Norcross is going to go first. Eileen got both her bachelor's and her master's degree in economics at Rutgers University, excuse me. Also worked at KPMG as a transfer analyst and Thomson Financial Securities Data doing financial analysis. She's going to be speaking on the work that she's doing domestically. Carol Boudreau is also a Rutgers grad, did graduate work in history at the University of Georgia and got her law degree at the University of Virginia. She, before coming to Mercatus, was the assistant dean at the George Mason University School of Law, and most recently completed tenure on the Working Group on Property Rights at the United Nations Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Each of our scholars is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I have my phone number and email address up there. If you have any questions about the Global Prosperity Initiative, I'd ask you to please feel free to give me a call or drop me an email. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Eileen.
Thank you for coming today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the new project that we're starting at Mercatus, which essentially looks at the relationship between the 3 levels of government. This involved the work we were doing at Mercatus, as Dan paid reference to, but also some of my own interests that stem from looking at federal grants and programs and their effects on subsidiary governments, the states and localities where the money ends up. So the title of this presentation is Federal Action, Local Effects, and that's really what I'd like to talk about, just broadly, some of the concepts that we're examining in this project. We can talk about that, some of the implications later. One of the concepts around this project is looking at the rules of the game. And government has a very important role to play. It helps set the rules in which economies operate. One of the operational questions of this project is, what are the impact of those rules? So what do you mean by rules? It's not just the tax and regulatory environment, but the programs that are developed, legislation that's developed in Congress, and other levels of government, and how those rules affect the intended object, the local economy, the state economy. Rules can also be developed on the state and the local level, and you're going to see sort of interaction between those three levels of government. And what are the effects of, let's say, a tax and expenditure limitation on the local level and a federal grant when it hits the ground? How does the locality ultimately budget in the face of these rules and make choices in what goods to provide? Another big concept in this project is around the idea of market-preserving federalism, and this comes out of the work of an economist, Barry Weingast, who says that, in a very excellent article, it's at the end of my presentation, he states that institutions must be designed to credibly commit the state to preserving markets. And what that means is that, again, this gets back to the important role that government has in thinking about the relationship between the three levels of government and the design of institutions. If we want a state that is strong enough, a government that is strong enough to protect property rights and to guard contracts and enforce contracts, is also strong enough to confiscate wealth. And that's an inherent tension in the design of a federalist system. So again, we should think about institutions in the sense of how they're designed and what are the signals that the federal government sends through that system in terms of preserving markets and freedom. So one of the rules I'd like to, or one of the effects I'd like to focus on right now is what are the fiscal effects of the rules that the federal level designs, or the state level, on lower levels of government. And as an example, the intergovernmental grant, a grant and aid. How does that change how states budget and what they choose to provide, the mix of goods that they choose to provide? And this is a really interesting topic. It's also the subject of scores of GAO reports over the years. GAO does really marvelous work, I think, in analyzing programs and looking at them from different angles. Not just, is it achieving its intended outcome, but what is the effect of this program on how states and how localities budget and in the choices that they make? Grant design is an entire subject in public finance and economics. And I'm just going to reference a few of these design features. Lots of rules come about in order to, obviously, to achieve an intended purpose. A mandate is a means of ensuring that the federal intent is met. However, they come with costs. They introduce rigidities and uniformity in the provision of services on the ground. So regulations associated with a particular program from the federal level are intended to achieve a particular outcome, yet they could introduce rigidities on the state or the local level. Another feature of a grant is the matching requirement. The reason matching requirements exist in some categorical grants is that it's intended to change the relative price of the goods so that the locality or the state is not bearing the full cost of that grant. However, it has an effect. That state or locality may commit more resources to a given policy area that's defined by the federal level in order to receive the match. They may or may not need that level of good, but this is the behavior they will engage in anyway. So this is just one of the effects that is spoken about in the literature and something that, again, GAO reports go through this and they analyze a lot of grants in these terms. Another feature is the maintenance of effort provision, which is similar to a federal match. The maintenance of effort provision is intended to guarantee that the locality or the state also commits some of its resources to a problem at a certain level in the absence of funding, federal funding. But again, it has the same effect in that it's dictating to the state or to the local level, you need to spend on this particular good. Resources are transferred even absent a need. Broadly speaking, these things are part of a subject area called fiscal illusion that's spoken about in economics. One feature of fiscal illusion is how does the locality view the federal money and how does it change its behavior when it receives this money from above? And this effect can occur when the state also transfers resources to the local level. Back in the late 60s, the idea was that in a lump sum grant, and an example of that would be, let's say, a block grant. A lump sum grant is supposed to be viewed as income when it hits the grant, that it's going to be spent on the targeted activity in full, and if there is money left over, it will be returned as tax cuts to the people. The locality no longer has to raise that money itself. However, right about the late 1960s, an effect was observed. It's called the flypaper effect. And what some economists discovered was that when federal grants hit the ground, they actually stimulate public spending. And the idea is that it sticks where it hits. And this term was coined by an economist, Arthur Oken, who said, what's going on here is that if you spend a federal dollar, the locality ends up spending more than if that dollar was raised locally. This effect has been observed in multiple contexts, multiple programs, multiple countries over the years. In fact, literature is huge. There's about 3,500 papers on this effect. The amount of spending that the locality increases spending by about 25% to 100% of the value of the grant, according to some studies. So this is a significant effect that's been observed in many grant programs and in many contexts. What's the relevance of this? I think right now we're looking at a very large stimulus package. A lot of it's going to come in the form of grants. And this is the kind of a discussion I think that would be very productive right now, is to consider what is the fiscal effect of any stimulus going through these programs, many of which have been analyzed time and time again over the decades. What will the fiscal effect be of state and local budgets? Will it create a need that may or may not exist? Will funds be dedicated to areas that are really going to vary significantly from locality to locality? The next subject of this presentation is really looking at state and local governments. That is, the question of what are the goals of the stimulus package is to bail the states out, essentially. They're in trouble. 41 states are facing budget shortfalls right now. The question is, how did they get there? Each state is facing its own unique situation. Some states are having budget problems because they've elected to expand pension systems when revenues were coming in. So there are structural problems in some of these states in terms of how they budgeted, and they're in trouble for a variety of reasons. And the question is, what will the stimulus do in each of these cases? That's one thing we're looking at. Another area of interest in this project is looking at the states on state level. Part of that is what I just spoke about, getting the diagnosis right. Why is a state like New Jersey in crisis? New Jersey has been facing budgetary problems for about 10 years. Reversing course is not easy. Some of the reasons for New Jersey's problems have to do with budgetary decisions that they've locked into place over a number of years. Fixing that is not going to be easy. I don't know that the stimulus is going to do it. The last area that we're interested in this project is looking at urban economies. The question around that is, why do some cities thrive and other cities lag? Why do some regions rebound from shocks and others do not? The Katrina project has looked at recovery in the Gulf and in New Orleans, but there are many cities in the United States that have suffered major economic shocks over a period of years and decades, and part of this project will ask questions about why are they there, what are the prospects for their recovery. One popular policy in helping localities is, and one issue area that I'm particularly interested in is policies that are focused on encouraging entrepreneurship and economic development. These policies come in many forms: tax credits, enterprise zones, and incentives. Do they work? And I would just say in conclusion that on balance, it's not clear that they do. The reason for that is, again, when you look at the effects of policies, is your policy picking winners or is it creating a neutral playing field? And the literature suggests that targeted tax credits are a form of industrial policy, that you're choosing the industry or the type of activity that you want to stimulate, rather than keeping the rules of the game neutral to allow entrepreneurs to identify what needs to be created. So this is just one policy area that we're examining in this project from the level of 3 levels of government, which is federal policy is created. What are the fiscal effects that policy has on lower levels of government, and does the policy achieve its intended purpose? These are some of the articles that I think are worth reading, and as it relates to what I've just spoken about, fiscal illusion, the effects of grants on lower levels of government. They include, I only have 2 GAO reports up here, but I would encourage anyone to just look at this literature on the fiscal effects of the policies that the federal government creates, where they have their intended effects, and what their effects are on the budgetary choices of lower levels of government. I think that's an aspect of the upcoming stimulus package that I haven't really seen discussed much, but I think it's going to have a very significant effect on how states and localities budget in the future. Thank you.
you very much. I'd also like to thank you for joining us because every one of you who joined us didn't join Cato. And that means that I can poke fun at the Cato people because you need to hear us and not them. So thank you very much. What I'm going to be talking about is a little bit of a different subject, but in fact it is related. Eileen is interested in why some states and some cities flourish and thrive, and why the people in those cities flourish and thrive in ways that they find valuable. And the question I'm usually looking at is, why is it that some countries flourish? Why is it that the citizens in some countries have opportunities to create better lives for themselves as compared to other countries around the world? So this is really the age-old question of economics. It's the question Adam Smith was asking in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. Why are some nations wealthy while other nations are either poor or they're stagnant or they're even kind of going backwards in terms of economic development? Dan has mentioned that we've done work on 5 different continents, but I don't do work on 5 different continents. I do work in Africa. And I primarily do work in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the kinds of comments that I'm going to be sharing with you today are, I'm going to provide a caveat because I went to law school, lawyers like caveats. My first caveat is that they're fairly general comments. So if any of you would like more specifics, I hope that you'll please always think of us at the Mercatus Center as a resource. I'm always happy to chat with you about particulars, especially particulars about our studies or your thinking on development issues. The second, so that's my first caveat. It's kind of general, my first caveat is general. My second caveat is that what I'm going to say is perhaps not applicable in every country, but is largely applicable to most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so if the kind of topic is what sort of lessons can we take away from international development at this point in our history, 50 years into international development efforts, 50 years into foreign aid efforts, what are the sort of general lessons that we've learned as a donor, multilateral and bilateral donor? A couple of general lessons, I think, and these will be familiar to you. First of all, as much as I would love to tell you that there's a silver bullet to solve the problems of poverty, and as much as that might make me more like Jeffrey Sachs, that's wrong. There is no silver bullet. There are no 4 easy steps to solve the problems of poverty around the world. It's a very complicated problem. It's complicated here in the U.S. It's complicated in inner cities. It's just as complicated in the slums of Nairobi as it is here, perhaps even more so. But just because we say there's no silver bullet, there's no one solution, doesn't mean that there aren't important issues in all poverty contexts that we need to take into account when we're thinking about what are the appropriate policy responses to poverty. So some of these overarching issues that I've seen time and time again doing fieldwork in Africa are the following, and I really think it comes down to these 3 things. Number 1, security. Security has to be relatively sound in countries in order for there to be development. So what do we mean by security? We mean that your stuff is secure, that the police aren't going to come into your house and take things away from you, or that a private predator isn't going to come into your house and take stuff away from you. And too often in these environments, security just isn't as good as it needs to be. Second, good governance. Right? There has to be more openness, more transparency, more accountability of governments in Africa to the needs of their citizens. And thirdly, and this is an issue that I feel very strongly about, there does need to be more trade openness. Openness not only to markets in the developed world, but especially openness to markets in the developing world itself. Average tariff rates in Africa are 33%. So while it's true that it's difficult for African farmers and African manufacturers to sell some of their products in the developing world, it's harder for them to sell to their neighbors than it is to sell to us in many important ways. So that's an important policy issue maybe that the new administration will be thinking about, how to promote some incentives within the African context to loosen up some of those trade barriers that make it difficult for Africans to trade with each other. When I think about international development in Africa, I think about the fact that both policy change and institutional change are essential. Policies do need to change to give entrepreneurs, to give local business people greater opportunities to do business in a non-harmful way. But in addition, institutions need to change as well, and that's the really hard part, getting solid institutional change to happen within countries. Because how much can we do from the United States to promote institutional change? We can do things perhaps like create a different incentive structure, which is what the Millennium Challenge Corporation is trying to do, create a different incentive structure for countries. But really, in order to get that institutional change on the ground, to get those open, transparent governments in Africa, you need to have someone who's willing to supply the change, and you need to have some group of people who are demanding the change. So happily for someone like me at Mercatus, I can think about supply and demand in terms of institutional change, not just in terms of what's the market for specialty coffee from Rwanda, for example. Recognizing that institutional change is tough, I want to just mention quickly a point that Dan brought up earlier. When you're thinking about how do you change institutions, how do you create policies, who's going to supply the change, who's demanding the change, is it civil society, is it who in civil society is demanding the change? It's also important to recognize in this context, in Africa and other developing countries, that there almost always is a gap between what the law says on the books and what actually happens in reality on the ground. And if you target policy change to what's written on the books, how can we change the code to make things better without understanding? Do people even pay attention to the code on the ground? Does anyone care that it's written into the law of Zimbabwe that women can inherit property? No, people don't actually really care about that because women do not inherit property in Zimbabwe. They're routinely, property is routinely grabbed from them. Are women treated as property chattel? Yes, they are. In Southern Africa, still treated as property chattel. It doesn't matter that countries have signed the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So doing property analysis in those environments requires that you really understand what that gap is and address that gap in some kind of effective way. I'm going to briefly talk about the upcoming South African election as an example, South Africa today, as an example of a country in sub-Saharan Africa that presents some challenges to us thinking about the country as an ally and as a partner. And that I think represents some of the typical challenges other sub-Saharan countries are facing. So why is South Africa is both exceptional and it's typical and representative. It's exceptional in that it's the largest, strongest economy in sub-Saharan Africa by far. In a way, for those of you who've been to South Africa, you know this, it's a first world country and a third world country joined together. So in that way, it's exceptional. But it's also fairly representative, I'd argue, in the following ways. It is a diverse and a complex environment. So it's not the kind of ethno-linguistic diversity, the kind of cultural diversity that many other African countries have. It's maybe not as diverse as Nigeria, but it's more diverse than Botswana, which we could describe as a great success story, but kind of a boring place. Not a lot of ethnic diversity going on in Botswana. Has obviously an extraordinarily difficult past and a history of colonization that was quite oppressive, history of apartheid that was quite oppressive for people. So that translates into a complicated present for the government of South Africa. Lots of difficult issues to be dealing with, and because it's a complicated present with many potential policy choices, that means, just like here in the US, right, there's an uncertain future. Who knows really what's going to happen in South Africa after the upcoming elections this spring? So the elections are going to be called pretty quickly. There's going to be parliamentary elections. The main groups who are contending are the ANC, which has been in power since the transition in 1994, a breakaway group called COPE, that really is representing the Thabo Mbeki political and economic strategies, and then the Democratic Alliance, which is always a minority opposition group in South Africa. So these upcoming parliamentary elections are trying to deal with some key issues, same issues you'd see all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So the country has really, in important ways, dealt with the reconciliation issue. The ANC says that they would like to move beyond reconciliation to deal with some more pressing concerns. What's the most pressing concern? Anyone know what the unemployment rate in South Africa is? So the unemployment rate here in the US is 25%. Is the narrow definition of unemployment in South Africa. And if you take into account the people who are discouraged and have stopped looking, 40%. 40%. This is the big issue in South Africa. What are we going to do about jobs? We cannot solve the problems of poverty unless we come up with a strategy to create jobs in the country, to get people who are poor into some sort of employment situation, to get them some kind of employment. But you also probably know, if you know anything about South Africa, that it's a crime-ridden society. Particular cities in South Africa, Johannesburg, might have crime rates that are rather similar to some cities. And I'm looking at Dan because I think it's actually quite similar to New Orleans. I think the crime rates in Johannesburg are similar to New Orleans. Washington's gotten so good, it's not like us, it's not like DC anymore, relatively speaking. But have to deal with problems of security and crime. How are you going to deal with that? You've got to educate your population. There are all sorts of lingering effects of apartheid that have made it difficult for many segments of society to receive a good education. So the goal is, how can we create a more equitable economy where there's growth for all people? Over the weekend, the ANC issued its election manifesto. Here's what we would like to do moving forward for South Africa. And so it's a really interesting moment of transition in South African society. And what the ANC has issued is essentially a South African stimulus package. If you were to read through the manifesto, which is available online, you'd see that the key focus for solving the problems of job creation, education, security, healthcare are state-led growth. So the state is going to become, at the national level, much more involved in supporting particular industries, in supporting particular efforts to create jobs, especially, say, like the mining industry, which is a big important industry in South Africa. So it's industrial policy of the sort we had in the United States in the 1970s, or it's similar in some ways to the kinds of economic policies that we had in the 1930s. And I think the question to ask are the sorts of questions that Eileen is asking about this kind of stimulus effort. Number one, or that Dan had mentioned earlier, are we going to have the same sorts of problems of flypaper, same sort of flypaper problems? Can you have a government, a sub-Saharan African government, even if it is the biggest one, even if it is the strongest one, even if it has the most resources, is it really going to be feasible for a national level government to push through a stimulus package that's going to require implementation at the provincial and the municipal levels? And I think this is really a significant question in the South African context, just like it would be a significant question in any African context, because there are serious challenges of capacity in the provincial and the local level governments. The national level government are, filled with lots of smart, bright people, but at the local levels, lots of people who have real challenges implementing directives coming from above. And that doesn't even raise the question of a challenge of resources. The ANC Manifesto, which focuses on state-led industrial policy, says there needs to be, this is a direct quote, massive public investment programs in South Africa, with a special focus on public infrastructure. An intensified land reform program that will seek to redistribute land more equitably and more quickly. Want to think about what that might mean in the context of being a neighbor of Zimbabwe. Eradicating illiteracy through free and compulsory education. The ANC is suggesting a phased-in, over 5-year new national health care initiative that would provide free health care at point of service to all citizens. I should say at this point, the language in the manifesto is that the private sector will be encouraged to participate. But you have to think about what the incentives would be for the private sector to participate in such a thing. Not a whole lot on details on fighting crime, other than we're going to get tough on criminals, and so we're going to spend more money on the police force. Expanded child support grants. That probably covers it. In other words, a lot of spending coming from the national level to stimulate economic growth and economic development within the country. And the question that both Eileen and I are raising really is this the right strategy? Is it the right strategy in the United States? Maybe yes, we'll see over the next couple of years if it is or not. In the case of an environment like sub-Saharan Africa, in the case of a country where they are generating lots of revenues, not only from the private sector, but from commodities, and we're in the middle of a commodity bust, is this kind of an effort really going to bear fruit? Or are there alternatives that actually might provide a meaningful, different meaningful strategy? So I'm going to end with just 3 things. Over the course of the last several years, we've done a series of studies in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at ways in which local people respond to problems of poverty. And my sense is that we can divide this work into 3 broad categories. Number 1, it does seem to be the case that in sub-Saharan African countries where there are broad-based economic liberalizations, in other words, where there's a liberalization of the economy that's not focused on benefiting just elites, like in Russia or Eastern Europe, that broad-based economic liberalizations really do amazingly positive things. They give lots of people within the society greater opportunities to pursue entrepreneurial ventures. And the example that I talk about often in this case is what's happened in Rwanda with the coffee sector, where there's been a massive liberalization that has helped both Hutus and Tutsis, especially Hutus. And it's helped everybody because everybody in Rwanda, almost everybody is still involved in agriculture. Still 90% of the society is involved in agriculture. So if you can provide incentives for countries to engage in broad-based liberalizations, that seems to create some jobs. That seems to lead to some economic growth. That seems to generate some wealth. Actually, one of my co-authors on the work on Rwanda is here with us, Huda Tobias, who's from the American Psychological Association. So I'm sure she'd be happy to chat with you about that. Also, here's another strategy that does seem to work on the ground that's a little bit different from stimulus, and that is devolving rights over resources to local peoples, to local communities. Key example of this in Africa is Namibia. The country's devolved rights to manage wildlife and natural resources to local people, not to local governments, to local people. Results have been really quite dramatic, quite positive. Local people are responding in very interesting ways and protecting the environment while also creating economic growth. And then finally, how can policymakers try to ensure that technologies spread to people in areas where there needs to be economic development? A great example of this in Africa is the spread of cell phone technologies. And spreading cell phone technologies required policymakers to do something. It required policymakers to allow cell phone companies to come into the market. It required policymakers to allow competition among cell phone providers. What's the result? Sorts of things that we would probably never have thought of. There's a whole business in Botswana of people who create ringtones and then sell the ringtones with, like, local artists are recording their ringtones. These local artists are getting something like royalties. And there's all sorts of subsidiary-related activities that go on around the cell phone business, whether it's selling cell phone cards, which is just one aspect of it, doing this ringtone thing, using cell phones as a technology to contact HIV/AIDS patients to remind them when their treatments are due. So I see those sorts of strategies, broad-based liberalizations, devolving meaningful rights, but there has to be a credible commitment, as I mentioned, devolving rights, and spreading technologies as some alternatives to the kind of fiscal stimulus that the ANC is suggesting today. I'm going to end on with that, and I'm sure we would both be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Just one quick note, right before we go to questions, if you could fill out those blue sheets while we're going through Q&A, it would be very helpful for us, again, to keep up the standards of our programs and make sure we're getting what you need. And please feel free to raise your hand and ask the question. Okay.
Yeah, I had a question for Carol Monroe. And that is, in terms of strategies for development, how much is there to this argument that you see that some of our strategies are doing more harm than good? An example you also hear is the mosquito net manufacturers in the U.S. will make mosquito nets, and then we send mosquito nets to sub-Saharan Africa, with the idea of helping people so that they don't get malaria and other terrible diseases with mosquitoes, but that it has the effect of undermining local manufacturers of mosquito nets. How much of a reality is this?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that some of our efforts are counterproductive, and they're well-intentioned, but a common theme throughout Mercatus' work is that we have a great respect for local knowledge and the ability of local folks on the ground, when given some scope to respond to incentives, to effectively solve problems. And so we may not have the right kind of local knowledge in some of our aid efforts to effectively deal with a problem like how do we best get mosquito nets into the hands of people who need them? It's a little bit like the food aid problem, right? We want to solve the food aid problem. We don't want people to be hungry. We want to get the food into the hands of the people who need it. Is the best way to do that really by using U.S. flagship carriers and buying surplus agricultural products from American farmers, or would it make sense to buy on local agricultural markets and support farmers in the developing world who may be able to produce the materials closer to the folks who are hungry? So we could go through a whole list of projects that are well intentioned, but that because they don't have that same amount of local knowledge, perhaps, often lead to unintended consequences. The other thing I oftentimes hear about the mosquito nets, and Utah probably has heard the same thing, the mosquito nets are distributed to people. They are valuable. People do want mosquito nets. It's not that people don't want them. But oftentimes they'll be used for other purposes because other purposes might actually be something the family values more. So you can use a mosquito net to catch fish. And that's understandable in certain situations. It's important to have that protein on your table. And if you can't get a net any other way, you might be willing to put up with a little malaria in order to put a fish on your family's pot.
Are there any other questions? No? One second.
I had a question for Ms. Norcross on the state and local spending that it's stimulated by the federal grant. Is that to reach the federal match that's required, or is that in addition to the federal match that's generally required?
Stimulative effects can occur in either situation. It's been observed in a lump sum grant context, which is a grant without a matching requirement. In that context, what's been observed is that a federal dollar behaves a little bit differently on the ground than a dollar raised locally or privately. So there's a stimulative effect associated with the block grant, and there's also a stimulative effect associated with the matching requirement in some cases. And in the matching literature, you're going to see a variety of things going on. Where a match is involved, sometimes the locality will spend more than they normally would have on a particular good in order to obtain a match. Then there are other features associated with that. Do they actually use it for the intended purpose or not? And that Medicaid GAO report I have there talks a little bit about that. So to answer your question, it depends. It depends on the program and the locality.
Hi, Ms. Boudreau. I was wondering if you had any more specific examples, like the cell phone story of, little success stories in Africa.
I do, and I'd be happy to share them with you. Some, just a couple I mentioned. Rwanda and the Namibia Community-Based Natural Resource Management were both supported by USAID grants, very small USAID money, supporting the NGOs, who in turn helped local people to become more entrepreneurial and find ways to access world markets. So in Rwanda, USAID will look at the growth of the specialty coffee sector itself as a success story. I look at it as a success story. I look at it as an example of relatively good use of foreign aid monies. In Namibia, the Community-Based Natural Resource Management Program has been a wild success, just a terrific example of what can happen when you give local people some power over their environment, and has generated both good conservation results and good economic development results. Also, a little bit larger USAID money going into Namibia. Some other good success stories that we've seen in Mauritius, the use of economic processing zones has transformed the country from a monocrop poor nation into a middle income country that's in the top 30 in terms of, it's a flourishing society, $10,000 per capita GDP this year, completely transformed the lives of women in the country. It's a traditionally Hindu society, and then we're relatively isolated until the economic policy changes. Now women routinely have high-level positions in businesses, they're entrepreneurs. So a kind of interesting liberation for women as a result of economic processing zones in that particular context. They don't always work, but it's worked reasonably well with some adjustments and corrections. And I'm very happy to chat with you further about that.
Thank you both to Eileen, Dorcas and Carol Goodwell for this wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot in a very short period of time, as always, at the Mercatus Centre. My question is to Eileen. I very much enjoyed how you framed federal action, its ecological effect on its effect on the system, on all these lower levels. Could you, off the top of your head, speak a little bit more to the elements of the stimulus package that might reach this accelerating effect of the fiscal dollar that we're using in any areas?
The stimulus package right now, it's a bit of an unknown in terms of the mix it will take. I have been following the process of this from when the mayors, the governors and the mayors testified in October. They were asked to bring their needs to the table. What would you like the stimulus to look like? The mayors put out this report that got a lot of press on here's how we intend to spend the dollars. And what I thought was interesting about the press around that is everyone said, oh my God, it's full of pork, it's full of earmarks. I said no. It's a bunch of government programs that I know pretty well, and these are legitimate spending within these programs. I think the stimulus will probably take a form pretty close to what's represented in that mayor's report. It's CDBG, it's surface transportation funding, it's highway aid funding. So I think the programs the vehicles are there. It's just a matter of how much money is going to be dedicated to what portion. I think that's what we don't know right now. So Medicaid is part of that mix. Then when we see infrastructure could take any number of programmatic forms. But I think it's likely CDBG and CBG, the new block grant program for energy, is probably going to be one of the vehicles. So that raises a question in my mind, not so much as, project merit. What are they actually going to spend the dollars on? Are they going to build a bridge? Are they going to build a tennis court? As the press has been picking up on, it's what is the effect of that transfer on the mix of goods that the states and the local governments will choose to provide in the future? Are they juggling priorities simply to get this sum? How's it going to affect states and localities? Is going to depend on how they're budgeting today, too, the choices that they've made in the past. Will this money subsidize bad choices in terms of how they've structured their budgets? Will it address the needs that actually exist in some of these places? I don't know. But I don't know if I answered your question, but I think the mix is unknown, but it's very likely to follow, I think, what we've been seeing discussed in the press in terms of the programs that monies will flow through.
Hi, my question's for Carol. I was just wondering whether you've done much research into the effectiveness of, say, Gamers, ABC, AIDS policy versus Bush policy, where 1/3 funding has to go to abstinence-only programs. And then I was also wondering what your views are on, say, how intertwined health issues and economic issues are. I mean, we've got societies where the most productive level of society is dying off, and so you have grandparents looking after their grandchildren. How effective will economic policies be until those health issues are solved?
In both cases, I've done virtually no work in health areas, so I'm sorry I'm not going to be more helpful, but I can direct you, I think, in some useful, towards some other folks who've done useful and good work. So in terms of the ABC, I really haven't looked at it, but there is a scholar at George Mason named Carrie Moss who's done some work on this ABC program. And Carrie can be gotten at through the economics department. I can certainly give you Carrie's contact information. And then, of course, the health issues are so important in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in southern Africa, where even though the HIV prevalence rates have been lowered over the last couple of years, this is still an enormous concern for those particular economies. And some folks who've done some good work on that are Roger Lee, who's at AEI. His work is very helpful.
or you need a demand for the change. Is there any demand in sub-Saharan Africa for broad-based economic liberalization? And would you characterize the change in South Africa in the past 13, 15 years as broad-based economic liberalization, or just kind of giving money to Mbaki's cronies?
Yeah, so I see a strong demand for job creation. If that strong demand for job creation has many different faces. So the average person who's on the street in Johannesburg, the average poor person on the street in Johannesburg may not say, look, what I need is an economic liberalization. That person's going to say, what I need is a job. And I want you as a government leader to tell me, how am I going to get that job? And the government can say, well, you're going to get the job because I'm going to give it to you. Or the government can say, you're going to get the job because we're going to create conditions in which there's going to be broad-based growth of not just the public sector, but the private sector, because we have a sense that private sector drives growth and is better at creating sustainable long-term jobs than the public sector is. There are certainly groups on the ground all throughout sub-Saharan Africa that are looking for liberalizations. There are lots of people who are aware of the fact that trade barriers within the continent are way too high and need to be lowered. There's obviously a lot of emphasis on lowering trade barriers, especially subsidies between the developing world and the developed world, so there's a lot of emphasis on that. So an organization like Oxfam, for example, which is obviously working in Africa but not African, lobbies quite effectively for the reduction of cotton subsidies in the developed world, because that's an issue that will help farmers in some parts of West Africa especially. But on the ground, there are civil society groups that would like to see more opportunity through economic liberalizations. The state has had a lot of control. African states have had a lot of control over the economy for a very long time. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been there since the colonial era. The question is, what would their societies look like if some of that kind of take control over the economy, if some of that were lightened, if that heavy hand were lightened?
Are there any other questions? All right, thank you very much. If not, if you guys could join me in thanking our speakers today. And if you would like to join us next week for our program on the budget process, please do so. We'll be around the same area, the same time next Thursday. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Fine, how are you doing?
Ownership to obtain bailouts and subsidies from the government. Whether you think that's good or bad, up for grabs, but much more likely, at least from studying the case of European golden shares, that subsequent bailouts and subsidies are much more likely. Also consider the case of the California Pension Fund. And I'm not here to beat up on CalPERS because they do a lot of good things in corporate governance. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make to you is that two goals, shareholder wealth maximization and looking out for constituencies. By constituencies, I mean people affected by corporations. Could be labor, could be environmental advocacy groups, could be consumer advocacy, wide variety of constituencies. Those two goals, shareholder wealth maximization and looking out for constituencies, there's a significant element of tension between those two goals. Sometimes they're on the same page, but there will always be a significant element of tension between those two goals. Now, sort of where you come out on which one you like more, I think sort of depends on your own preferences. But don't let anybody tell you, and I'm here to defend only the proposition that the objectives in the TARP legislation, in the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, one of which is sort of mortgage renegotiations, facilitating renegotiations over foreclosure, and the other being minimizing the cost to the taxpayer from TARP, are not completely on the same page. There's going to be some element to which those goals are mutually inexclusive. Don't let anybody sort of convince you, the Pollyannish view, that those goals can be both accomplished. There will be some cost to TARP from giving constituencies power over the corporation, and that the constituencies tend to gain more power when governments have equity stakes in private companies. I think the case of Europe's golden shares are instructive. The case of CalPERS also instructive. CalPERS critics would tell you the Business Roundtable